She had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a letter signed by a man named Caleb Hawthorne, a man with whiskey-colored eyes and a Sharps rifle in the crook of his arm. But when she finally climbed that frozen mountain on Christmas Eve and knocked on his door, three identical men opened it. Three. And the one in the center looked at her photograph, looked at her face, and said the words that nearly killed her. "You have come up the wrong mountain, ma'am. There is no one here who sent for a bride." Now let me tell you what really happened on the Bitterroot that winter of 1876. Because the letter that brought her there was a lie, but it was the most important lie ever told. The wind on Christmas Eve of 1876 did not blow across the Bitterroot Mountains. It hunted. It came down from the high passes with a sound like a wounded animal looking for something to kill, scraping its long claws along the eaves of every cabin foolish enough to stand in its path. It pressed itself against shuttered windows and rattled iron latches and slipped its cold tongue under every door it could find. By midnight, the snow was falling so thick a man could lose his own hand if he stretched it past his face. And on a porch at 7,000 feet, a young woman in a Boston traveling dress raised a small Pharaoh-type photograph in a hand that no longer felt like her own. She held it up before three men, three identical men. Each of them stood half a foot taller than her father had ever been, broad as church doors, bearded and weathered and silent with eyes the color of whiskey held to firelight. They blocked the doorway like a wall of timber. Behind them in the warm orange throat of the cabin, a fire crackled. Before them in the howling white, nothing stood Eleanor Whitmore, 23 years old, 2,000 miles from the only home she had ever known, with $11 in her bag and a dying photograph in her trembling fingers. The man in the center looked at the photograph. He looked at her face. Then he looked at the photograph again, and something behind his eyes went dark, the way a window goes dark when a candle is blown out from the inside. "You have come up the wrong mountain, ma'am." His voice was low and rough as broken stone. "There is no one here who sent for a bride." Eleanor's lips were the color of bruised plums. Her lashes were stiff with ice. When she spoke, the wind nearly stole the words before they left her mouth. "Then I have traveled 2,000 miles to die." She did not see the floor of the porch come up to meet her. She did not feel the strong arm catch her around the waist before she struck the boards. She only knew in some last, bright corner of her fading mind that the photograph had slipped from her fingers, and that somewhere far away a man was shouting her name, except he could not be shouting her name because he did not know it yet. Then the white nothing closed over her, and Eleanor Whitmore was gone. Before we follow her into that cabin, friend, if it's stories of the high country and hard men and women who refuse to break are the kind of thing that warms your evenings, take a moment now to subscribe. I tell tales like this every week from the porch of memory, and I would be honored to have you ride along with me. And while you are at it, leave a comment below and tell me where in this wide country or this wide world you are listening from tonight. I read every one, every single one. Now, let us go back. Let us understand how a young woman from Boston came to be lying half frozen on a stranger's porch in the Montana Territory on the coldest Christmas Eve in 17 years. Let us understand the letter she carried in her pocket, the letter that lied to her and the man who wrote it without ever meaning to. Let us understand all of it because every story has a beginning. And every beginning, if you trace it back far enough, started with somebody trying to do somebody else a kindness. Eleanor's father, Dr. Wendell Whitmore of Beacon Hill, Boston, had been the kind of physician folks wrote about in the city papers when he refused to charge widows for house calls. He was tall and stooping and wore wire spectacles that were always sliding down his nose, and he believed two things above all others. He believed that medicine was a vocation, not a trade. And he believed his daughter Eleanor was the finest mind he had ever encountered in any classroom of any sex. He taught her Latin at 12. He taught her to set a broken finger at 14. He taught her to read a fever the way a sailor reads a sky. And on the first Sunday of every month, for as long as Eleanor could remember, he wrote letters to other physicians across the country, sharing what he had learned, asking what they had seen. Dr. Whitmore died in his reading chair on the 11th of June, 1876, with an open medical journal in his lap and his pipe still warm beside him. His heart, the organ he had spent 40 years repairing in others, simply quit on him without warning. Eleanor was 22 years old, and the world she knew ended with the closing of one tired blue eye behind a pair of wire spectacles. She had no mother. Mary Whitmore had been buried 11 years before on a December morning, so cold the gravediggers had to break the earth with a pick. Eleanor had no brothers, no sisters, and no aunts who would take in a grown woman of marriageable age. What she had instead was a man named Augustus Pembroke. Pembroke owned the bank that held what little paper her father had signed. He was 58 years old, silver-bearded, soft-handed, with the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. He had buried two wives already. The first, Adelina, had been thrown by a horse in the spring of 1869. The second, Cordelia, had succumbed to a wasting illness that no Boston physician seemed able to identify in the autumn of 1873. There was talk in certain parlors. There was always talk. Pembroke himself, when the topic arose, would lower his eyes and murmur something about the cruel hand of Providence, and the talk would die. He came calling 3 days after the funeral. He sat in her father's reading chair without asking. He laid out a stack of papers on her father's desk without asking. And he explained to Eleanor in the gentle, patient voice of a man teaching arithmetic to a slow child that her late father had owed him a sum of money so vast it would consume the house, the medical books, the piano, and the rocking chair her mother had nursed her in. There was a way out, of course. There was always a way out in the world Augustus Pembroke moved through. He took her hand. His skin was cool and dry as old paper. He told her she was in his judgment, a young woman of unusual quality, and that a man in his position required a wife of unusual quality, and that he believed a marriage between them would be of mutual benefit, and that, of course, in such a case, all unfortunate matters of inheritance might be quietly dissolved. Eleanor did not faint. Eleanor was not the fainting kind. She thanked him with the steady courtesy her mother had taught her, walked him to the door, locked it behind him, and then went to the kitchen and was sick in the basin. That night, by the light of a single candle, she did 3 things. She wrote out in her own clear hand every fact she knew about the deaths of Adelina Pembroke and Cordelia Pembroke. She placed that paper inside the pages of her mother's old Bible in the book of Esther, between the verses where one woman saved a people by refusing to be afraid. And she went to her father's desk and took out the bundled stack of newspapers he had subscribed to from across the country, including a paper from Chicago called the Matrimonial Times. She read by candlelight until dawn. She read every advertisement on every page. Most were vulgar. Most were obvious lies. Most were written by men who described themselves in language that made her want to wash her hands. But on the third night of reading, she found one. It was 3 lines long. It said only this: Mountain Homesteader Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory. Honest work. Hard winters. A fair share of what is built. Letters in good faith only. See Hawthorne in care of Missoula Post. She read it 4 times. There was no boasting in it. There was no flowery talk about lonely hearts or moonlit walks. There was only a man far away offering an honest exchange. She wrote her reply that same night. She told C. Hawthorne the truth of her situation, leaving out only the name of Augustus Pembroke. She told him she could read, write, cook, mend, and assist in the setting of bones. She told him she would expect no luxury, only safety and the freedom to earn her place. 3 weeks later, the reply arrived in Boston. It was short. It was written in a careful, slightly clumsy hand, as if by a man who used a pen rarely and respected it when he did. It said that Mr. Hawthorne would be honored to receive Miss Whitmore, that the journey would be hard, but the cabin was sound, and that she would not be made to feel a stranger. The signature was simply C. Hawthorne. Tucked inside the letter, folded in wax paper, was a small ferrotype photograph of a bearded man standing on a porch with a Sharps rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was not smiling, but he was not unkind. He looked, Eleanor thought, like a man who had once known how to laugh and had simply forgotten. She did not tell Pembroke she was leaving. She sold the piano and the rocking chair and bought a ticket on the westbound train. She left Boston on the morning of October the 18th, 1876, with $11 sewn into the lining of her coat, her mother's Bible in her bag, and a photograph of a man called C. Hawthorne pressed against her heart. She did not know that he had not written the letter. She did not know that he had never sent for any bride at all. She did not know that on a porch in Missoula 3 days before, an old stage driver named Hank Dooley had told a teamster over a tin cup of coffee that the Hawthorne brothers up on Bitterroot had finally answered an advertisement, and that a young Boston lady was on her way, and that he could not for the life of him picture how that was going to end. The teamster had relayed this gossip to a cousin in Helena. The cousin had relayed it 2 weeks later in 3 telegraph lines down to a clerk in a Chicago hotel. And the clerk, who owed money to a man named Augustus Pembroke, had relayed it in exchange for the cancellation of his debt to Pembroke himself. Pembroke read the telegram in his Boston office. He folded it once very precisely. He looked out the window at the gray Atlantic light, and then he reached for his pen and began to make inquiries about a man named Silas Crane, who, as everyone in certain circles knew, had personally seen to the hanging of 14 runaway debtors in 3 territories, and who was available for the right fee to attend to a 15th. By the time Eleanor Whitmore stepped down from the stagecoach in Missoula on the morning of December the 23rd, in a wind that smelled of pine smoke and snow, Silas Crane was already 3 days behind her on the same road and gaining. She did not know any of this, of course. What she knew was that the air at this altitude felt thinner than any air she had ever breathed, and that the mountains in the distance stood up like the broken teeth of some vast and ancient creature, and that the man who had agreed to drive her up the last 40 miles to Hawthorne Land was an old fellow with 2 missing fingers on his left hand and a face like a piece of weathered saddle leather. His name was Hank Dooley. He helped her up onto the wagon seat without saying much. He clucked to his team. The wheels groaned. Missoula fell away behind them. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. The road climb switched back on itself, climbed again. The pines grew thicker and darker. The light went from the gray of pewter to the gray of slate. Then Hank Dooley cleared his throat and asked her without turning his head whose place she was bound for. "Hawthorne," she said. The wagon stopped. It did not slow. It stopped. The horses, sensing some change in the hands on the reins, shuffled their feet and snorted out 2 great clouds of frozen breath. Hank Dooley turned in his seat and looked at her for a long moment, and the kindness in his old eyes was suddenly tinged with something that looked to Eleanor terribly like pity. "Hawthorne, ma'am, up on Bitterroot." "Yes." She felt a small, cold finger of fear walk up between her shoulder blades. "Mr. C. Hawthorne, we have corresponded." Hank Dooley scratched the white stubble on his chin with one of his 3 remaining fingers. He looked up the road. He looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I have known the Hawthorne boys since they were tall enough to spit over a fence rail. There are 3 of them. Triplets, you understand. Born of William and Anna Hawthorne, both buried this last 80 years past on account of a band of riders called the Callaways, who came through their valley in the summer of '68 and did what such men do. The 3 boys lived through it on account of being down at the creek when it happened, and they have stayed up on that mountain ever since." He paused. He chewed the inside of his cheek. "Ma'am, the eldest of those boys is Caleb. He took a wife once, a girl from this very town named of Sarah, sweet as creek water. Brought her home in the spring of '72. She died in the autumn of '73 of typhoid fever that nothing on this earth could cure. And I am telling you straight, ma'am, because you seem like a lady who deserves straight talk. Caleb Hawthorne stood at her grave 3 years ago this autumn, and he swore on the bones of his mother that he would never take another wife so long as he drew breath. He has not been down off that mountain to court a woman in 3 years. He has not so much as said hello to a female of the species in town, and except to tip his hat. He did not send for a bride, ma'am. He could not have. There is some kind of mistake here, and I am sorry to be the one to put the words to it, but you have been lied to." The wind moved through the pines above them. Eleanor sat very still on the wagon seat. The cold air burned her lungs in small, precise stabs. "Drive on, Mr. Dooley," she said quietly. "Ma'am, I don't think you ought to." "I have come a very long way, Mr. Dooley. There is a man at the end of this road, whoever he is, and a roof and a fire. I will let him speak for himself before I let any rumor speak for him. Drive on, please." He looked at her another long moment. Then he shook his head the way a man shakes his head when he has just seen a brave thing and a foolish thing at the same time and cannot decide which he is looking at, and he clucked to his team. The wagon began to climb again. The light failed early in those mountains. By 3 in the afternoon, the world had gone the color of slate and old iron. By 4, the first flakes had begun to fall. By 5, the snow was coming down so thick that Hank Dooley had to lean forward over the dashboard and squint to keep the road in sight at all. He was muttering to himself by then, and to his horses, and to the Almighty in roughly equal measure. He stopped the wagon for the second and final time at the mouth of a long, narrow valley. He pointed up through the falling snow with one mittened hand. "There, ma'am, up that draw, about 1.25 miles. You will see the smoke from the chimney before you see the cabin. I cannot take the wagon another inch. The grade is too steep and the snow is too deep, and I would not get my team back down before dark. I am sorry." He helped her down. He set her small leather trunk in the snow at her feet. He pressed an extra wool blanket into her arms, refused the dollar she tried to give him, and looked at her one last time with that mixture of pity and respect. "You are a brave one, ma'am, I will say that. Now you walk and you keep walking, and you do not stop and you do not sit down. The cold up here is not like the cold in Boston. The cold up here will lay you down to sleep and never wake you. Are you hearing me?" "Yes, Mr. Dooley. Thank you." He climbed back onto his wagon. He turned his team. He took one long last look at her, this small, straight figure in a Boston traveling dress, disappearing into the snow. And then he was gone, and the only sound left in the valley was the wind in the pines and the soft roaring of the snow as it came down out of an invisible sky. Eleanor picked up her trunk. She turned her face into the wind. She began to walk. She walked for what felt like 100 years. The trunk grew heavier with every step. Her boots, fashionable Boston boots meant for sidewalks, in lecture halls filled with snow at the third stride and never emptied again. The cold went through her woolen coat as if the coat were paper. It went through her dress. It went through her skin. It settled in her bones and laid eggs there, and the eggs hatched into a deeper cold she had not known the body could feel. She fell once, she got up, she fell again, she got up. The third time she knew with terrible clarity that she could not stand again unless she found something to lean on, and there was nothing to lean on, only pines and snow, and the long, dim throat of the draw climbing forever upward. And then in the swirling white above her, she saw it. A thread, a pale, faint, beautiful thread. Smoke. The smoke from a chimney rising straight up in a brief lull of the wind before bending sideways and tearing apart in the gale. She put her head down. She walked. The cabin came out of the snow the way a ship comes out of fog. First the orange square of one shuttered window, then the heavy timber walls, then the deep porch and the iron latch and the long roof piled white. It was bigger than she had expected. There was a barn behind it, a smokehouse, a small fenced garden sleeping under the snow. This was no hermit's hole. This was a working ranch. This was the home of more than one man. She climbed the steps. Her legs would not bend properly. Her hand, when she lifted it, was not her hand. She could not feel her fingers. She could not feel her face. She knocked. She thought she knocked. She could not be sure. The wind ate the sound. She knocked again harder with the side of her closed fist, and from somewhere inside she heard a sudden, absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that falls in a room full of men when they have all stopped breathing at the same instant. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the drop of a wooden bar, the lift of an iron latch. The door swung inward. The wind rushed in past her, and the warmth and orange light rushed out, and there in the doorway stood three men. Three identical men. She had not been prepared for this. The letter had not prepared her for this. The photograph had not prepared her for this. Her mind, which prided itself on being sturdy, simply stopped for a moment and refused to proceed. Three men, the same height, the same broad shoulders, the same dark chestnut hair, lit with sun streaks, even in winter, the same square jaw, the same two-day stubble, the same striking amber eyes. The one in the center had a faint scar that ran in a pale line down through his left eyebrow. The one on the right had a slightly broken nose, an old break, healed crooked. The one on the left held himself a little quieter, a little softer, with the long hands of a man who knew books as well as axes. But these were small things. The first impression, the great hammer blow of impression, was that she was looking at one man reflected in two mirrors. The man in the center, the one with a scarred eyebrow, held a folded piece of paper in his hand. It was a letter. It was creased and worn, and it had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. He had been about to drop it into the fire. She could see behind him the orange tongues of the hearth licking up to take it. His amber eyes moved from her face to the small leather trunk at her feet and back to her face, and his jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he said, "we are not expecting any visitors." She fumbled at the inside pocket of her coat. Her fingers were so cold she could not work the buttons. She forced them. She drew out the photograph in its wax paper. She held it up. "I am Eleanor Whitmore," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she steadied it. "I have come from Boston. I am to be married to Mr. C. Hawthorne." She held the photograph up higher. The man in the center looked at it. His face did not move. But behind his eyes, very slowly, all the light went out. The man on the right, the one with the broken nose, made a small wounded sound in the back of his throat. The man on the left, the quiet one, closed his eyes. The man in the center took a long, slow breath. "Ma'am," he said again, and his voice was the broken stone voice. "You have come up the wrong mountain. There is no one here who sent for a bride." The world tilted. Eleanor felt the porch begin to slide sideways under her boots. She heard her own voice from a great distance say the only thing that was left to say. "Then I have traveled 2,000 miles to die." The dark came up. She did not feel the strong arm that caught her around the waist. She did not feel herself being lifted easily the way a man lifts a child. She did not feel the second pair of arms close around her legs. She did not hear the third man bark sharp commands about hot stones. Hot stones get the buffalo robe, build up the fire, and a whole lot of language he would have apologized for in calmer company. She did not hear the iron latch drop. She did not hear the heavy timber bar fall back into place. She only knew in some last small flicker that her cheek was against rough wool that smelled of pine smoke and leather, and a faint sharp sweetness she could not name, and that under the wool was a chest, and that under the chest was a heart, and that the heart was beating very fast. Then she was nowhere at all. She came back to the world by inches. First the smell, pine smoke and wood smoke and the resin of seasoned spruce. Then the sound, a fire that was not just burning but roaring. Then a heavier sound under that, a slow, steady thumping like a horse's hooves at a walk. Her own heart, she realized after a long, puzzled moment. Her own heart beating again. She opened her eyes a quarter inch. She was lying on a low bunk near the hearth. She was wrapped in a buffalo robe so heavy it pinned her gently to the mattress. She could feel through the robe the pressing warmth of three flannel-wrapped river stones, one at each hip and one at her feet. Her wet outer clothing was gone, draped over the back of a chair to drum. She was in a clean linen shift she did not recognize, and that smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of scent a woman puts in a chest of drawers, the kind of scent that had not been put in this drawer for at least 3 years. She did not move. She let her eyes drift, just her eyes around the room. It was a long timber room with a high beam ceiling. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the beams. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall. A heavy plank table stood in the center with 4 hand-built chairs and one fifth chair, a rocker off in the shadows beyond. The walls were lined with shelves, books on one shelf, tin cups and ironware on another. A row of long rifles racked above the door. 3 men sat at the table. They were not looking at her. They were looking at one another. Each of them had a tin cup of coffee, and none of them were drinking it. The fire popped. The wind pressed and released against the shutters. A long silence stretched between them, and Eleanor, lying very still, understood that she was watching the end of an argument that had been going on for some time. The eldest, the one with the scarred eyebrow, spoke first. His voice was quiet, but in the quiet was a thing like a knife being drawn. I told you both. 6 months ago I told you, I will not take another wife. I said it standing on Sarah's grave. I said it sober the next morning, and I said it sober every morning since. And now there is a young woman half frozen on my hearth because the two of you could not respect a man's word. The one with the broken nose made the wounded sound again. He set down his cup. Caleb, we did not know it would come to this. We thought the letter would die in some Chicago wastebasket. We thought no decent woman would answer a notice that plain. We thought if any did, you would meet her, you would talk to her, you would be the man we knew before Sarah, and what? The eldest voice did not rise. It did not need to. And I would what? Forget her, bury her with a second grave. The youngest brother, the quiet one, spoke for the first time. He did not look up from his coffee. We did not write that letter to bury Sarah Caleb. We wrote it because we have watched you bury yourself. The room went very quiet. The fire popped. The eldest, the one called Caleb, leaned forward. He pressed the heels of his hands against his closed eyes. When he lowered his hands, his face was the face of a man who had spent 3 years on the rim of a deep well and who had just been told on Christmas Eve in the middle of a blizzard that he would have to look down into it again. I wrote the cancellation, he said. 2 weeks ago, I wrote it and I gave it to Wyatt to ride down to Missoula and put on the eastbound mail. I gave it to him myself, Wyatt. He turned his head. Did you mail that letter? The brother with the broken nose, Wyatt did not answer. Wyatt, did you mail that letter? Wyatt looked at the table. He looked at the fire. He looked at his brother. No, he said. I rode down to Missoula. I went into the post office. I had the letter in my hand. And then I thought of you brothers sleeping out on the porch in October because you could not stand to be inside the cabin where she died. I thought of the bottle I found behind the woodstack last spring. I thought of how you have not laughed once in 3 years, not once, and how a man who does not laugh is a man dying slow. And I put the cancellation in the stove of the boarding house, and I rode home and I lied to you. And whatever you say to me, brother, whatever fist you raise to me, I will stand and take. But I would do it again. I would do it again tonight. Caleb stared at him. A log shifted in the fire. Sparks rose. Eleanor on the bunk in the buffalo robe closed her eyes again because her eyes were filling and she did not want them to see her cry. She was so tired. She was so far from Boston. She was lying in the home of a man who had not asked for her, who did not want her, whose dead wife's night shift she was wearing, who in all decency would have to put her on a sled in the morning and send her back down to a town where Augustus Pembroke's reach was already extending its long, pale fingers across the country to find her. And yet in this room, 3 men were arguing, and the argument was not about her at all. The argument was about love. The argument was about a brother who had stopped laughing and 2 younger brothers who had committed a foolish, reckless, almost holy act of disobedience to try to get him back. A small sob escaped her before she could trap it. The argument at the table stopped instantly. She opened her eyes. 3 pairs of amber eyes were looking at her now. The youngest brother is already on his feet, moving toward her. The middle brother, Wyatt, sat frozen with his hands flat on the table. And Caleb, the eldest, the one she had spoken to on the porch, stood up slowly like a man rising in a courtroom. He came to the side of the bunk. He did not kneel. He did not touch her. He stood at a respectful distance, his big hands hanging open and still at his sides. and he looked down at her in the firelight. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was different now. The broken stone was still there, but under it was something else, something quieter and more careful, like a man speaking near a wounded animal he does not wish to startle. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an honest accounting. The letter you answered was written by my brothers in my name without my knowledge. I never sent for a bride. I learned of the deception 2 weeks ago. I wrote a cancellation. My brother here did not mail it. You have come to a house that did not call for you, and you have come at the worst hour of the worst storm I have seen in 7 winters, and I do not know yet what we are going to do about that. But I know this. You will not freeze tonight. You will not go hungry tonight. No man in this cabin will lay so much as a finger on you tonight or any other night for as long as you are under this roof. You have my word on that. A hawthorn keeps his word." He paused. He looked at the fire. He looked back at her. "In the morning when you are stronger, we will sit at that table and we will work out together what comes next. Until then, I would be obliged if you would rest. Jesse here will bring you broth. Whatever you need, you have only to ask. Do you understand me, ma'am?" She nodded. She could not speak. He turned to go. He had taken 2 steps when she heard her own voice, thin and cracked, come out of her mouth without permission. "Mr. Hawthorne." He stopped. He turned back. "There is a paper," she said, "in the pocket of my coat. It fell. When I fell. Please, it is important. Please find it." Caleb's amber eyes flickered to the chair where her wet things were drying. He crossed the room. He bent. He went through the pockets of her coat with the careful, detached respect of a man searching the effects of the dead. He drew out a small, folded paper. He unfolded it. He read. The room went very still. He looked up. The look on his face was not a kind look. It was not an unkind look. It was the look of a man who has just understood in the space of 3 lines of paper that the situation he is standing in is far worse than he imagined. "Wyatt," he said quietly. "Jesse, come here." His 2 brothers came to stand beside him. He held the paper out so all 3 could read it. Eleanor watched their faces in the firelight. She watched the broken-nosed brother's jaw clench. She watched the youngest brother's eyes close. The paper said only this: "Pembroke knows Boston. He is sending a man. Run." It was unsigned. It had been written in haste on a torn piece of stationery from the Chicago hotel where she had spent her last night east of the Mississippi by a porter who had seen her likeness on a wanted bill nailed to a livery wall and who had whispered the warning into her hand along with the bill itself. Caleb folded the paper. He folded it once, twice. He folded it small. He held it in the closed palm of his big, calloused hand, the way a man holds a live coal. He looked at his brothers. "Wyatt," he said, "when the storm breaks, you ride to Missoula. You ride for Marshal Beckett. Tell him a young woman is up here on Hawthorne land and that a Boston man named Augustus Pembroke is sending a hired hand to take her or kill her or both. Tell him I want it on the record. Tell him I will not be moved off this mountain, and neither will she. Tell him to bring his deputies and any honest gun he can find." "Caleb," Wyatt said. "Brother, you said this morning she was leaving. You said tomorrow we put her on a sled." Caleb looked at the floor. He looked at the fire. He looked at Eleanor lying small and pale and stubborn in his dead wife's bunk, in his dead wife's night shift, with his dead wife's buffalo robe pulled up to her chin. "That was this morning," he said. "Things have changed." He turned without another word and walked out of the cabin into the storm. The door closed behind him, the bar dropped, and the wind hunting up there along the eaves took the silence inside the cabin and pressed against it and could not get in. The morning came, but it did not come the way mornings come in Boston. There was no rooster. There was no rattle of milk wagons on cobblestone. There was only a slow, grayish lightning of the cracks around the shutters, and the soft hiss of new snow falling on the roof, and the deep, steady breath of 3 men sleeping in 3 different corners of a cabin that had not held a sleeping woman in 3 years. Eleanor opened her eyes. The fire had burned down to coals. The buffalo robe was warm, Her body, which had been so cold the night before that she had believed it would never be warm again, ached now in 100 small places the way a body aches when it has been brought back from a place it should not have gone. She lay very still and let her eyes drift up to the rafters. Bunches of dried herbs hung there. Sage, yarrow, wild mint. She knew them all. Her father had taught her every one. She heard a soft footstep. The youngest brother, the quiet one, was kneeling at the hearth. He moved a pine split with iron tongs, banked the coals set on a fresh log. He did not see her watching. The firelight caught the side of his face. He was, she realized, a beautiful man. Not in the way a city man is beautiful, in the way a long winter pine is beautiful. Weathered sun streaked honest in every plane. He felt her gaze. He turned. He did not startle. He simply met her eyes. "Morning, ma'am." "Good morning." "I have water on for tea. My mother had a way with mountain herbs. I think we have what your throat needs after the cold you took. Will you take a cup?" "Yes, thank you. Mr. Hawthorne, is it?" A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first smile she had seen in this cabin. "Jesse," he said, "we are all Mr. Hawthorne in this room. It would only confuse the conversation. The eldest is Caleb. The middle is Wyatt. I am Jesse. There were never any other children, and there are no other Hawthorns within 50 miles. So you may use our names without any worry that you are being too familiar. We have all dragged you in from a snowdrift. We have lost our standing on ceremony." She laughed. It was a small laugh, thin as paper, but it was a laugh and it surprised her. He looked pleased. "Where are your brothers, Jesse?" "Caleb is in the barn. He has been since before light. He works when he is troubled. Wyatt is up on the ridge breaking trail toward Missoula. He will leave for the marshal as soon as the wind drops, which it will by midday. The signs are right." He brought her the tea. He set it on a small stool beside the bunk within easy reach. He did not crowd her. He moved away again to the table where he picked up a piece of leather harness he had been mending and resumed his work. He gave her in the most natural way the gift of being alone without being abandoned. She sipped. The tea was warm and slightly bitter and very good. She felt a small loosening in her chest, a knot she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. The cabin door opened. Cold air rushed in. Caleb stamped snow off his boots on the threshold and ducked his head under the lintel. He carried an armload of split pine and the smell of horses and frost. He set the wood beside the hearth without looking at her. He shed his heavy coat. He hung it on a peg. He turned. He saw her sitting up against the headboard with the tin cup of tea in her hands, and he stopped where he stood. For a long moment he simply looked at her. He did not seem to know what to do with the looking. Then he nodded once the way a man nods at a fellow traveler on a road, and he crossed to the table and sat down opposite Jesse and began to clean his hands with a rag. Eleanor cleared her throat. "Mr. Hawthorne, Caleb, may I speak with you?" He looked up. The amber eyes were guarded, but they were not closed. "You may, ma'am. I would prefer to speak sitting at your table if I am able. It is not a conversation to have lying down." He considered her. Then he stood and walked to the bunk and offered without comment the support of his arm. She took it. The forearm under her hand was the size of a fence post. She rose slowly. The buffalo robe slipped. Jesse, without looking, lifted a folded blanket from a peg beside the hearth and brought it over and laid it across her shoulders, and she was wrapped in decent again before she had time to feel exposed. They moved as people who had lived together a long time, these two. Caleb walked her to the table. He pulled out the chair her father would have called the master's chair, the one at the head, and he set her in it. Then he sat at her right hand and Jesse at her left, and the three of them faced one another across the worn plank wood. Caleb laid his big hands flat on the table. "Speak your piece, Miss Whitmore." She spoke. She told them without flourish the whole thing. Her father, the Beacon Hill physician, who had spent 40 years writing letters to colleagues across the country, his death, the papers Pembroke had laid on the desk, the proposal, the candle and the Bible and the matrimonial times, the reply she had written. the reply she had received, the journey, the note from the Chicago porter, the wanted bill. She did not weep. She had wept on the road, and she had wept the night before in the buffalo robe, and the well had run dry. She told it the way her father had taught her to tell a case history, with the relevant facts in order and the unnecessary words left out. When she was finished, the cabin was quiet for a long time. Caleb stared at the table. Jesse stared at his hands. Then Caleb said very quietly, "Your father was Dr. Wendell Whitmore of Boston." She had not yet told them his given name. She had said only Dr. Whitmore. She felt suddenly the small, fine hairs rise along the back of her neck. "Yes," she said. "How did you—" He stood up. He went to a tall pine cabinet against the far wall. He opened a drawer. He drew out a small wooden box hinged with brass, the kind of box a man keeps for the few papers in a life that he intends to keep forever. He brought it to the table. He set it down. He opened it. He drew out a packet of letters tied with a piece of brown twine. 8 letters, maybe 10. The paper was good paper. The ink was the brown, black ink of a careful man's hand. He laid them on the table in front of her. "3 years ago, this last autumn," he said in a voice that had gone almost gentle, "my wife took the typhoid fever. I telegraphed every physician whose name I could find in every city west of the Atlantic. I am not a wealthy man. I sent the wires anyway. Out of every name I sent to, exactly one man wrote me back. He did not ask after my account. He did not ask my standing. He sent me by return post every piece of advice he had on the management of typhoid, in cold climates, every herbal he had learned from old farm practice, every kindness he could put on paper. He sent medicine twice at his own cost. He never asked for so much as a postage stamp in return. My wife died anyway. There was nothing on this earth that could have saved her. But for 6 months after she died, that man kept writing. He wrote to ask how I was. He wrote to ask if I was eating. He wrote to ask if I had brothers. I never answered him. Not once. I could not. I was not a man in those months. I was a hole in the shape of a man. Eventually the letter stopped. He laid his hand on the packet. He pushed it across the table to her. His name was Dr. Wendell Whitmore of Boston. He signed every letter the same way. Yours in service to medicine. Beacon Hill. She put her hand on the letters. She did not pick them up. She could feel through the paper the shape of her father, the careful hand, the slightly too generous spacing between the lines which her mother had always teased him about, the smell very faint of his pipe tobacco, which had soaked into every page of every letter he had ever written from his reading chair. She could not speak. Caleb's voice, when he spoke again, was nearly a whisper. "I owe him a debt I cannot pay, a debt I never even tried to pay." And on Christmas Eve, in the worst storm of 7 winters, his daughter walked up onto my porch. Jesse beside her very quietly said, "It is not coincidence, brother. It cannot be." Caleb did not answer that. He did not need to. Eleanor finally drew a breath and let it out, and the breath shook coming out. Then she said, "I am not a stranger here, even if you did not send for me. Even if my coming was a mistake, I am the daughter of a man who tried to save your wife, and you are the man my father, in the end of his life, hoped someone would be. He told me once, he said, 'Eleanor, if you ever find yourself with no road home, you will look for a man who keeps his promises and not his ledgers. That is the only kind of man worth anything in this world.'" Caleb closed his eyes. He did not open them for a long moment. When he did, he said only, "We will talk now about how you live here, not whether, how." And in that one small change of word from whether to how, the room shifted, and a door inside Eleanor Whitmore that she had not known was closed swung quietly open, and a small, clean draft of something she had not felt since the day she buried her father moved through her, and that something was hope. The terms they spoke of that morning were practical and bare. Caleb would sleep in the barn loft where there was a stove and a pallet and 4 good wool blankets and where he said he had slept many nights in 3 years anyway. Wyatt would take the small room at the back off the kitchen that had been intended for a child. Jesse would take a pallet by the hearth because, as he said with a faint smile, the hearth was the warmest place in the cabin, and he had grown soft in his old age. Eleanor would have the bedroom. The door of the bedroom locked from the inside with an iron bolt as thick as her wrist. Caleb showed her the bolt without comment. He did not need to comment. The showing was the comment. She would cook the meals, which she could already do passably. She would mend. She would keep the cabin. She would teach the brothers their letters in the evenings, which she insisted upon the moment she discovered that Wyatt could only read at the level of a child of 8, and that even Caleb sometimes had to ask Jesse for help with a long word in the bank papers from Missoula. In exchange, the brothers would hunt and provide. They would teach her slowly the work of the mountain, the setting of a snare, the reading of a ski, the handling of a horse on ice, the use of a gun. There would be no other obligation between them. The word marriage was not spoken. The word bride was not spoken. The word wife was not spoken. They were arrangement and friendship in the long grace of strangers thrown together by weather. And that was enough for now and would be enough until something else, if anything else were ever to come, came of its own time, and not by anybody's pushing. When the terms were settled, Caleb rose. He pulled on his coat. He stood at the door. There is one more thing, Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it like a small, warm coin pressed into her palm. Yes. Wyatt rides for the marshal as soon as the wind drops. Beckett is a good man. He will do what he can. But I want you to understand, the man Pembroke has sent Crane is not a man who quits. He will come up this mountain. We do not yet know when. We do not yet know with how many, but he will come. And while he is coming, you will not leave this cabin without one of us. You will not draw water from the spring without one of us. You will not feed the chickens without one of us. Do you understand? I understand. Good. He looked at the floor, he looked at her. The amber eyes were tired. They were also, she noticed for the first time, very kind. And one further thing. When Crane comes, I do not intend for him to find you afraid. Buens. I intend for him to find you ready. That means by spring, you will know how to load a rifle and how to fire it and how to ride a horse over ice and how to keep your head when men with bad intentions ride into your yard. Will you let us teach you those things? She thought about Boston. She thought about the parlor and the piano and the wire spectacles and the soft hands of Augustus Pembroke holding her own in her father's reading chair. Yes, she said, teach me everything. He nodded once. He went out into the cold. The wind dropped at noon, just as Jesse had said it would. Wyatt rode for Missoula on the gray gelding before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. He carried letters in oilskin, a list of names, and a leather poke of coin. He carried Caleb's instructions, which he had repeated back twice. He carried also, although nobody spoke of it, his own private penance for the lie he had told 2 weeks before about a cancellation and a stove in a Missoula boarding house. He turned in the saddle once at the bend in the trail, and he tipped his hat to the cabin, and then the pines closed around him, and he was gone. Eleanor watched him from the window. Jesse watched her watching. He will be all right, Jesse said. He has ridden that trail in worse weather than this. It is not the trail that worries me. Then you understand my brothers already. That is half the battle. She turned. He was at the table again mending the harness. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and tea and the faint resin of fresh split pine. The light through the eastern window was the soft pewter light of a clearing winter day. She walked to the shelves of books that lined the wall behind the rocking chair. The rocking chair, Caleb's wife had once sat in the rocking chair that nobody in this house she suspected had touched in 3 years. She ran her finger along the spines. A volume of Whitman, a volume of Tennyson, a medical compendium older than her father's, a small Bible, a book of Scottish ballads, the spine cracked from much reading. These are yours, she said without turning around. Mine and my mother's. She was a Scot before she was a Hawthorne. She came across the ocean with her father when she was 9 years old. The books were hers. After she passed, they became mine because Caleb does not read for pleasure, and Wyatt does not read at all without prodding. Anna Scott Hawthorne. Yes. Tell me about your mother, she said. And Jesse Hawthorne, who in 3 years had spoken the word mother, only twice set down the harness and folded his long hands on the table and told her. He told her of the small farm in the Bavarian foothills, where his great-grandfather had stopped on the way west. He told her of the Scottish ship his mother had crossed on. He told her of the schoolhouse she had taught in for one season in Missoula before she had married a tall, quiet rancher named William Hawthorne. He told her how she had named her three identical sons in the order they were born after three Bible men she admired. Caleb, who walked into a hard land. Wyatt, which was not Bible at all but a name from a book she loved. Jesse, the father of David, which she had said was a small joke on herself, since Jesse had been born last and smallest. He told her that on a Tuesday afternoon in the August of 1868, the three boys had been down at the creek catching trout, and that they had heard the shooting from a mile off, and that by the time they had run home through the timber, their mother and father were already past saving. He told her that his brother Caleb, at the age of 25, had carried both bodies into the cabin alone and had washed them with his own hands and had dug the graves with a pick because the ground was hard and had not spoken aloud for 11 days afterward. He told her more softly that the men who had done it, a band of riders called the Cowboys, had been hunted down 2 years later by a posse out of Helena, and that of those riders 3 had been hanged, 2 had been shot, and one, the youngest, had escaped and was rumored to live still somewhere in the lawless country east of the Tetons under a different name. He told her that Caleb had made a quiet promise 3 years after the funeral that he would not spend his life looking for that last man because his mother would not have wanted that for any son of hers. And he told her that his brother had kept the promise, but that Eleanor would do well to know that there was a piece of Caleb Hawthorne that had never quite come home from the creek. When he was finished, the cabin was very quiet. Eleanor sat down in one of the chairs at the table. She did not sit in the rocking chair. She did not yet know whether she would ever sit in the rocking chair. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You are going to live with us, Eleanor, for a season at least, perhaps longer. You should know what kind of men you are living with. We are not bad men, but we have been hard used. My father used to say that hard use is what makes a tool worth keeping." Jessie smiled. "I think your father and my mother would have liked one another." The days began to take a shape. In the mornings, Eleanor rose with the first gray and built up the fire and put on the water for coffee, and by the time Caleb came in from the barn, she had a hot breakfast on the table eggs from the chickens that Jessie kept warm in a corner of the kitchen, fried side meat biscuits with the last of the autumn honey. Caleb would eat. He would thank her. He would go back out. He worked. He always worked. The stock had to be fed. The wood had to be cut. The harness had to be oiled. The roof had to be cleared after each new fall. He worked the way a man works when work is the only thing standing between him and a thought he does not want to have. On the third morning, when her strength had begun to come back, she walked out before any of the brothers had risen for the day. She walked past the barn, she rounded the corner of the smokehouse, and she found beneath a single tall, lonely pine 3 weathered stones standing in the snow. William Hawthorne, 1820 to 1868. Anna Scott Hawthorne, 1823 to 1868. Sarah Ann Hawthorne, 1851 to 1873. Beloved wife. On the third stone, the smallest of the 3, lay a small bundle of dried winter sage tied with a strip of blue ribbon. The ribbon was new. Someone had laid it within the last day or 2. She stood in the snow a long time. She did not know in that moment what the proper thing was. Then she remembered her own father, who had taught her that in the old country of his grandfather, a small stone laid upon a grave was a way of saying, "Was here, I have not forgotten." She bent and picked up a smooth river stone from the bare patch under the pine, and she laid it on the corner of Sarah Ann Hawthorne's headstone where it would not blow away, and she whispered, "I will take care of him." She told no one. She walked back through the new snow and let her tracks be the only record. In the afternoons when Caleb was in the barn, and Wyatt, after his return from Missoula, was out checking the trap line, Jesse would teach Eleanor things. He taught her to set a wire snare for rabbit the loop just so the bait of withered turnip placed just there. He taught her to read a snowfall, the new on top of the old, the depth of the layers, the story they told about which night had been which. He taught her the names of every herb that hung from the rafters and which were for fever and which for cough. In the evenings after supper, by the orange light of the hearth, she taught the brothers their letters. This was where she came to know them. Caleb read at the level of an educated farm boy who had been pulled out of school at 14, which in fact he had. He read with patience and pride and the steady plodding of a man who refused to give up a sentence until he had broken it. Wyatt read with embarrassment. The first night when she set a primer in front of him and asked him to read aloud, his big ears turned the color of a winter apple, and he stared at the page like a man being asked to lift a building. She did not laugh. She did not smile. She only said quietly that her father, the doctor, had not learned to read well himself until he was 19, because his own father had needed him in the fields, and that any man who could rope a steer and skin a deer and shoe a horse had more than enough room in his head for a paragraph. By the third night, Wyatt was reading aloud from a McGuffey's primer. By the seventh, he was reading from Whitman slowly with reverence, the way a man reads a thing he never thought would be his to read. Jesse, who already read better than either, sat at the corner of the table and listened with a soft pride in his face that he made no effort to hide. Caleb did not always sit with them in the evenings. Sometimes he would, sometimes he would not. Sometimes he would come in from the barn after Eleanor had gone to bed, and she would hear him through the timber wall sit down in the rocking chair in the shadows beyond the table, and rock slowly for a long time in front of the dying fire. He never sat in that chair when she was awake. She never spoke of it. She only knew, lying still in the dark, that he was sitting in his dead wife's chair, and that he was thinking, and that whatever he was thinking, he was at last beginning very slowly to think it through. On the 8th morning, she opened the door of the small cedar wardrobe in the bedroom because she needed a clean apron, and she found folded carefully on the top shelf a small woolen overcoat the color of dark moss. It was a woman's coat, hand-knit, lined with rabbit. It was not a Boston coat. It was a mountain coat. It was the warmest piece of clothing in the room. She closed the wardrobe. She came out into the main room. Caleb was at the hearth tightening the leather binding on the handle of an axe. He did not look up. Caleb. There is a coat. He did not look up. The rawhide squeaked under his thumb. That was Sarah's. Wyatt brought it down from the loft last week after you came. I told him to. Yours is a Boston coat. It will not see you through January. Wear it. She would have wanted you to. She did not abide waste. I cannot wear her. Eleanor. He looked up. The amber eyes were steady. It is a coat. It is wool and rabbit fur in time. Sarah is not in it. Sarah is up under the pine tree, and Sarah is in the rocking chair I do not let myself sit in when anyone can see, and Sarah is in my head every morning when I wake and every night when I close my eyes. The coat is just a coat. Wear the coat. Please. She wore the coat. It fit her almost exactly. She did not know what to do with that. She did not say anything about it. Neither did he. The first time she laughed in that cabin, truly laughed, was the afternoon Wyatt taught her to shoot a Colt revolver. He had set up a row of 6 tin cans on a fallen log behind the smokehouse. He had lectured her about the weight of the piece, about the kick, about not closing both eyes, about not anticipating. He had handed her the gun. He had stepped back. She missed the first can clean. The second, she clipped at the corner. The third, she knocked off the log. The fourth and the fifth, she hit dead center. The sixth, she missed by the width of her thumb, but it was a near miss, and she had cocked the hammer herself between every shot, and her hands had not shaken once. Wyatt stood with his hands on his hips. He looked at the cans. He looked at her. He looked at the cans again. Eleanor. Yes, Wyatt. Have you fired a pistol before? My father had one. He kept it in his desk drawer. He sometimes took me out to the carriage house in the afternoons when there were no patients. He was a very serious man about most things. About this, he was less serious. Eleanor. Yes, Wyatt. You let me lecture you for a quarter of an hour about how not to shut both eyes. I did, Wyatt. He stared at her. Then a small, slow, wonderful grin broke across his broken nose face and he started to laugh. He laughed the loud, honest laugh of a man who had just been tricked by a woman half his size in the matter. He considered himself most expert in, and the laugh broke loose in the cold air and rolled up over the smokehouse and across the yard. In the open door of the barn 50 yards off, Caleb stood in the shadow with a curry comb in one hand watching. He did not laugh. He did not smile. He only stood there for a long moment and watched the woman in his dead wife's mossy coat shooting tin cans clean off a log, and watched his middle brother bent double laughing for the first time in 3 years. And something inside the locked room of his chest moved a small fraction of an inch toward unlocking, and he turned and went back to the gray mare. And he did not let himself think any further than that. That night, Eleanor and Jesse were alone at the kitchen table. Caleb was as he sometimes was after supper out walking the perimeter. He did this with no explanation. He went out with a rifle and a lantern, and he walked the far edges of the yard, the line of trees, the place where the trail came up from the lower draw. He always came back. He did it less for the prowling animal Eleanor suspected and more for the prowling thought. Jessie had her seated at the table with the herb tins in front of her. He was teaching her the difference between the dried mountain mint that was good for the stomach and the dried pennyroyal that was not. She was reaching past him for the small tin marked yarrow because she had wanted to ask him a question about it, and her foot caught the leg of the rag rug under the table. She lurched. The yarrow tin began to fall. A hand came out of nowhere and caught her elbow. She had not heard him come back in. Caleb had come back in. He was just behind her chair. His big, calloused hand closed around her elbow over the wool of her sleeve, and the yarrow tin somehow was already steady on the table, caught with his other hand. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. She could feel through the wool the work hardness of his palm. She could feel the careful way he was holding her elbow, as if she were a thing he had been entrusted with and intended to hand back undamaged. She could feel her own breath catch against her will in the back of her throat. She could feel the heat rise to her face. He let go. He let go like a man letting go of a hot iron. He took one step back. He set the yarrow tin in its place on the shelf. He cleared his throat in a way that was not quite a clearing of the throat. "Excuse me, Miss Whitmore." "Caleb." "Ma'am." "Caleb, please, you may use my name." He looked at her. He looked at the floor. "Eleanor." "And I will use yours." He said her name like a man speaking the name of a horse he was just beginning to trust with care, as if the wrong inflection might startle the animal off. Then he turned and went out to the porch, and she heard through the door the sound of him drawing in a long, slow breath of the cold air, the way a man does when he has just stood close to a fire he had not meant to stand close to, and he wants to make certain his coat has not begun to smoke. That night, lying in the dark, Eleanor reached up slowly and slid back the iron bolt on her bedroom door. She did not know why she did it. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that for the first time since she had crossed the threshold of this cabin 9 days before, she did not feel the need of a bolt between herself and the men who slept in the next room. She left the door unlocked. She turned her face to the wall. She pulled the buffalo robe up to her chin. Outside, the wind in the pines was a low, steady song, now not a hunting cry. The storm had passed. The cabin was warm. The dried herbs hung in their bundles. The books leaned together on their shelves. In the loft of the barn, 50 yards across the snow, Caleb Hawthorne lay on his pallet with his hands folded behind his head and stared up into the dark and did not sleep for a long time. And 40 miles down the mountain, in a cold room above a saloon at the edge of Missoula, a thin gray man named Silas Crane finished cleaning the long octagonal barrel of a Sharps rifle, set the rifle in the corner open, a leather wallet, took out a small pharaoh-type likeness of a young woman with cornflower blue eyes and honey-colored hair, studied the likeness for a long, quiet moment, and then put it back in the wallet and blew out the lamp and lay down in his clothes to sleep. He would ride at first light. He had business up the Bitterroot. The morning of the 12th day in the cabin came clear and bright and so cold the air itself seemed to crackle. Eleanor woke to silence, not the silence of a storm, the other silence, the silence of a world frozen so deep that even the wind had been laid down. She came out of the bedroom in her wool dress and her dead wife's mossy coat and stood for a moment by the window looking. The thermometer Jesse had nailed to the porch post read -30. The brothers were already up. Caleb had been to the barn and back. Jesse was at the hearth turning bacon. Wyatt sat at the table with a tin cup of coffee in both hands and a face that had not yet decided to be awake. "Christmas in 2 hours," Wyatt said into his cup without looking up. "Christmas was a week and a half ago, brother." "Christmas in this cabin," Wyatt said, "was the night a young woman fell down in the snow on our porch and 3 grown men forgot how to behave. There has been no Christmas since. I am putting it at noon today and I intend to do it properly." He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the floor. Then Caleb walked without a word to the cedar chest under the window. He knelt. He opened the lid. He moved aside 2 folded wool blankets and a paper-wrapped bundle and a small carved wooden horse that Eleanor would later learn had been a toy of his when he was a boy. From the bottom of the chest, he drew out a tin can. The can was wrapped in oiled paper. He wiped the dust off the label with the side of his thumb. The label was faded, but the picture on it was still clear. A bright yellow fruit cut in halves glistening in syrup. California peaches. He stood. He brought the can to the table. He set it down. He did not say anything for a moment. "I have been keeping this," he said at last, "for a special occasion. For a hard day. For a day when the winter had gone on long enough that a man needed to remember the taste of summer. I never used it. I never could find a day that seemed worth it." He looked up. The amber eyes met Eleanor's. "I think today is the day." He took his hunting knife from his belt. He worked the lid open with a slow, patient turning. The smell came up out of the can and filled the cabin, and it was not a smell that belonged in that cabin. It was the smell of a July afternoon. It was the smell of an orchard 1,000 miles away. It was the smell of sunshine, and Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed it in and remembered for one bright moment a porch in Boston where her mother had served peaches and cream from a blue china bowl, and she had to put a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. He spooned the peaches into 4 tin cups, 2 halves and a measure of syrup in each. He gave the first to Eleanor. He gave the next to Jesse. He gave the next to Wyatt. He kept the last for himself. "Merry Christmas, ma'am," he said quietly, late but earnest. She could not speak. The 4 of them sat at the table in the cold, bright morning of the 12th day and ate canned peaches with tin spoon, and the syrup was as sweet as anything Eleanor had ever tasted, and Wyatt closed his eyes when he chewed, and Jesse laughed once softly at the look on his older brother's face, and outside the air crackled with cold, and inside the cabin for the space of one slow, shared cup of summer, every man in the room laid down his armor, and every memory in the corners of the room laid down its weight, and there was only the firelight and the syrup and the 4 of them. When the last spoon clinked against the bottom of the last tin cup, Caleb cleared his throat. He stood. He carried the empty can to the hearth and set it there as if it were a thing worth keeping. Then he picked up his rifle and he went out to walk the perimeter. That should have been the day. That should have been the day after the peaches, when nothing else happened, when the world held its breath for a few hours longer in honor of a small kindness in a small cabin. The world did not. The world as the world will scent the wolves. They came an hour after noon when the sun was at its highest and weakest in the southern sky, and the cold had begun to sink its second deeper bite. They came down off the high country where the elk had thinned and the deer had moved low. They came hunting. There were 5 of them. The leader was a great gray timber wolf with a silver muzzle and the gaunt look of an animal that had not eaten in a week, and starvation will turn a wary creature reckless. And the smokehouse behind the cabin smelled of cured venison from 100 yards away. Eleanor was at the table peeling potatoes when she heard the first low scraping sound from beyond the wall. She set down the knife. She lifted her head. Wyatt was already on his feet. Wyatt had heard it before she had. "Smokehouse," he said. Caleb came in through the front door at the same instant, pulling his coat back on over the shoulder he had only just finished thawing. "I count 5 tracks. Big tracks. They have been on the ridge 2 days. I should have seen them this morning. Wyatt the Sharps, Jesse the Henry." "Eleanor." She was already on her feet. "Yes." "Stay inside, bar the door behind us. Do not open it for any voice but ours. Do you understand?" "I understand." He met her eyes for 1/2 second longer than he needed to. Then he was gone and Wyatt was gone with him, and Jessie the youngest paused only to press a small Colt revolver into her hand butt first. "It is loaded, 6 in the cylinder. Cock the hammer with your thumb. 2 hands, you remember." "I remember." He went out. The door closed. She crossed the room and dropped the heavy timber bar into its iron cradle. The bar fell with a deep, solid thud, the same sound that had once been Caleb's favorite sound in the world, the sound of the world locked out, and now Eleanor Whitmore stood inside the locked world with a Colt revolver in her hand and listened. The shooting started 30 seconds later. She would never afterwards remember the order of the sounds. She would only remember pieces. The deep, slow boom of the Sharps like a piece of the mountain falling. The faster, sharper crack of the Henry, a voice shouting, a voice that was Caleb's. A high, keening yelp of an animal. Another boom, a cry that was not an animal, that was a man, that was Wyatt. A scuffle, the rip of fabric. A snarl, a second cry. Caleb this time. Caleb shouting, "Jesse, Jesse behind you." Then after what could not have been more than 2 minutes but felt to Eleanor like an hour's silence, she stood with the Colt in her hand. The fire popped. A single ember fell into the ash pan with the small, bright tick of metal. A heavy pounding on the door. "Eleanor, it is Caleb. Open the door. Open the door now." She lifted the bar. He came in carrying his middle brother in his arms. Wyatt's coat was open. His left forearm hung wrong. The sleeve of his shirt was dark with blood from elbow to wrist. His face was the gray-white of pulled bone. Behind Caleb came Jesse, walking, but with one hand pressed against his own neck, where the right shoulder met it, and blood was coming through his fingers in small, steady pulses that Eleanor recognized at once as not arterial. Thank God, not the bright red spurt of a torn artery, but a vein deep, ugly, dangerous if not closed. Caleb laid Wyatt on the table. Eleanor's potatoes scattered to the floor. "How bad?" Caleb said. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his coat that was not his. Eleanor was already at the table. She had Wyatt's sleeve open in 3 motions of the small kitchen knife. The wound was a tear, not a clean bite, 4 punctures, and a long ripping drag where the wolf had pulled. The bone was not broken. The big vessels were not severed. The flesh was a ruin. "He will keep his arm," she said, "if I close it now and we keep it clean." "Jesse, sit. On that chair. Press hard. Do not let go." "Yes, ma'am," Jesse said with a small surprised respect. "Caleb, the kettle. Boil it. I need clean water more than you think. And the small leather bag from the wardrobe in the bedroom. The one tied with green twine. Bring it to me." "Yes." She did not look up to see whether the eldest Hawthorne, the man who gave the orders in this house, had blinked at being given orders by a woman in his own kitchen. She had no time to look up. Her hands were already inside the work. Her father was speaking through her hands. Dr. Wendell Whitmore, dead these 6 months in his reading chair in Boston, was standing at his daughter's elbow in a frozen cabin 2,000 miles away. And her hands were his hands, and her hands knew what to do. She washed. She irrigated, she probed. She found with the tip of a small silver instrument from her father's kit the broken end of a wolf's tooth lodged in the meat of Wyatt's forearm, and she drew it out and she held it up to the firelight, a yellow ivory shard, and she set it on the table and went on. She closed the wound with cat gut from her father's bag, the way he had taught her in the carriage house when she was 16, small, even stitches, the way a woman closes a fine seam. Wyatt did not cry out. Wyatt watched her work with a stunned, still admiration. Once he said very quietly, "Hell, Eleanor," and Caleb, standing behind her with the kettle, said, "Wyatt," in a tone that meant not in front of the lady, and Wyatt said, "Sorry, ma'am." And that was the only language any of them used for the next quarter of an hour. When she was done with Wyatt, she went to Jesse. She lifted his hand from his neck. She bent close. She made a small, approving sound. The cut was deep, but it had missed everything important. She closed it with 5 neat stitches and a strip of clean linen, and she pressed his big shoulder with her palm and said, "You were lucky." "I was lucky to be in the right house," Jesse said, "when I was bleeding." She looked up at him, and there was a brightness in her eyes that was not from the fire, and he gave her very softly the second smile she had ever seen from him. And it was a smile that said, "You are family now," whatever any letter ever said or did not say. Then she turned to Caleb. He was leaning against the wall by the hearth. His coat was still on. There was a long, dark, wet patch on the outside of his right thigh, halfway between hip and knee, and he had not mentioned it. "Caleb." "It is nothing." "Caleb, off with his coat." "Eleanor, it is a graze. The big one took a piece out of him with his teeth, but the leg held. I can stand on it." "You are standing on it now because there is a wall behind you. Coat off." He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, in the manner of a man unbuckling a thing he did not wish to unbuckle, in mixed company, he shed the heavy coat. The leg of his trousers was soaked from mid-thigh down. She cut the trouser leg open with the knife. The wound was a deep, ragged tear, the print of the great gray leader's 4 punctures in a curving line and 1 long, deep gouge. The muscle had held. The bone had held. But the bleeding was steady, and it was the kind of bleeding that if a man kept walking on it and did not let a doctor's daughter close it, would put him down by sundown. "Sit," she said. He sat on a chair by the hearth, jaw clenched. She washed, she irrigated, she closed. The catgut went in and out. She did it the slow, careful way her father had taught her on the worst Boston nights, the nights of accidents on the docks, the nights when a man's leg was the difference between a family eating and a family not. Caleb did not move. He did not flinch. He did not breathe half the time. The whiskey-colored eyes were fixed on her face and not on his leg, and as her stitches went in his eyes did not leave her. She felt the gaze. She did not look up. She did not stop. She finished. She tied the last knot. She trimmed the gut. She wiped his leg clean with a square of white linen. She covered the leg with the same square, bound it with another long strip, knotted it tight. She sat back on her heels. She looked up. He was still looking at her. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said. His voice was a dry voice. It was the voice of a man who has just held himself silent through quite a lot. "You have steadier hands than any man I know." It was the kind of thing a man says when he has finally worked his way around to meaning it. He had been turning the words over in his mouth for days, she suspected, and only now, with her stitches in his leg and his blood drying on her sleeve, had he found the air to say them. She felt the heat rise to her face. "My father taught me," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I am thinking on." He held out his hand. He did not stand up. He held out his big calloused hand, palm up on his knee. She did not know for a heartbeat what he wanted. Then she did. She laid her own small hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it very gently, the way a man closes his hand around a thing he does not intend to crush, and he held her hand for the space of 3 slow breaths, and then he let it go. "Thank you," he said. She stood up. Her knees were not entirely steady. "Wyatt needs water now. Beef tea if there is any. He has lost a great deal of blood. Jesse should not lift his arm for 3 days. You should not put weight on that leg for 2. And what should you do, ma'am? I should sit down in about a minute, once I am sure none of you is going to fall over. Jesse laughed. It was a soft laugh, but it was a real one. Wyatt on the table smiled with his eyes closed and said to no one in particular, I am keeping her brother. You will have to fight me. Wyatt, Caleb said, I jest brother. You do not jest brother. I do not entirely jest. I will allow that. The cabin was quiet for a little while, to that, the way a cabin is quiet after a small storm has passed with everyone too tired to move, and the fire popping, and the smell of wood smoke and clean blood and yarrow mixing in the warm air. Outside, the 5 wolves lay in the snow behind the smokehouse. 3 were dead. 2 had run. Caleb would, when he could walk on his leg again, drag the carcasses out to the edge of the timber and let the cold do its work because the pelts were too torn to save, and the meat of a starving wolf was a meat no Hawthorne would put in a pot. That night, after Wyatt had eaten what little he could keep down and refused twice the willow bark tea Eleanor had pressed on him, and Jesse had finally fallen asleep with a book open on his chest by the fire, Eleanor put on her dead wife's mossy coat and stepped out onto the porch. Wyatt was on the porch already. He sat in the rough wood chair Caleb had once carved, leaned forward with his good elbow on his good knee and a small clay jug at his feet. The jug was not coffee. He took a slow pull off it and looked out into the dark. Wyatt. Eleanor. She sat in the chair beside him. The cold was a clean knife against her face. The stars over the bitter root were so thick and so close, they seemed less like stars than like a shaken silver. Should you be drinking with the blood you have lost? Probably not. Are you going to take it from me? No, but I will sit with you. I am obliged. They sat. He took a pull. He offered the jug. She shook her head. He set it down again. He said nothing for a long time. Then in the slow, soft way a man says a thing he has not let himself say, since the spring he stopped riding to Missoula, he said it. Her name was Margaret O'Connell. Her father was a blacksmith in Missoula, an Irishman off a boat in '70. She had hair the color of new copper and a temper to match, and she could outshoot every man in the county under 30. I met her at a barn raising in the spring of '72. I thought she was the sun coming up out of the prairie. I rode down to that town every Sunday for a year. I sat in the front pew of the wrong church for her. I drank tea in her father's parlor and kept my hat on my knee. And in the spring of '73, when I asked her father for permission to court her with intent, he looked me square in the face and he said, Mr. Hawthorne, I admire you, but my daughter is not going to spend her life 40 miles from a doctor and a midwife and a piece of civilization. She is not going to bury her babies on a mountain. She is going to marry a man who can give her a town. I am sorry, and he was sorry, and he was right. And 6 months later, she married a flour merchant named Sullivan, and they moved to Denver. And a winter later, I started telling people I had never gone down to Missoula on a Sunday for any reason, and I started believing it. Until tonight. He took another pull off the jug. You ask me why I have not left this mountain in 3 years. You ask me why I will not. That is your answer. The mountain does not betray you. The mountain does not prefer a flour merchant. The mountain holds what you put on it, and it asks for nothing back, and that is enough for a man like me. That is enough. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, Wyatt, have you written to her since? No. Why? Because she has babies in Denver who are not mine and a husband who is not me, and I will not be the man who comes back and disturbs a woman's life because I never made my peace with my own. That is a good answer. It is a Hawthorne answer. There are worse ones. She thought a moment. And if her life were not as you imagine it, would you write to her then? He did not answer. He looked out into the dark a long time. Then he said only, It is a cold night, Eleanor. Go inside. You have done enough today. She went inside. The morning of the 14th day brought a wind off the southwest that was warm. Not winter warm, spring warm. It came up out of the lower country, and it brought with it the sweet, rotting smell of pine sap thawing and creek banks softening, and Caleb stepped out onto the porch with his coffee and stopped where he stood. Jesse came out behind him. "Brother, I see it. Chinook. I see it, Jesse. It is too early. It is the middle of January. A Chinook comes in February, sometimes March. Then it is not a Chinook. It is the front of one. The real one is behind it." Jesse looked up the valley. "How far behind?" "A day, maybe less. And it will not be a Chinook when it gets here. It will be the storm that the false Chinook drove down ahead of itself. They always come in a pair, brother. The warm one is the smile. The cold one is the fist." He drank his coffee. "Get the stock in. All of it. I want every animal we own under timber by sundown." Eleanor. She had come to the door behind them. "Yes. You will not leave the cabin tomorrow. Not for any reason. Not for water. Not for wood. I will bring everything inside today. We will lay in for a week, possibly two. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Good." He drained the cup. He went down the steps. He moved a little stiff in the right leg. He did not let it slow him. The cold front hit at dusk the next day the way a hammer hits an anvil and dropped the temperature 37 degrees in an hour. The wind that followed it was a wind of a different breed. It was not the hunting wind of Christmas Eve. It was the killing wind. It was the wind that in older country had been given names that no man spoke twice. It came across the ridge with a roar like a freight train, and it pushed a wall of fine dry snow ahead of it, and inside an hour the cabin was being buried at the rate of an inch every 5 minutes against the north wall. Inside, the four of them played out a small, careful evening. Jesse read aloud from the volume of Whitman to Wyatt, who could not yet hold a book steady with his bandaged arm. Eleanor mended. Caleb sat in the rocking chair. He had not in 3 years sat in the rocking chair where anyone could see. He sat in it now. He sat in it because every other chair in the room was taken, and because, although he did not say so, he was tired, and because, although he did not say so even to himself, he had decided that morning out on the porch with the coffee and the false Chinook on his face, that the rocking chair was a chair and not a shrine, and that his dead wife had never once in life asked him to make a shrine of anything. He rocked. He did not rock fast. He rocked the slow, tired rock of a man who is letting a part of his life set itself down at last. Eleanor saw it. She did not comment. She did not need to. It was just past 9 in the evening when they heard the horse. A horse in that wind was not a possible thing. A horse in that wind on a buried trail in pitch dark ridden up the long draw to a cabin 40 miles from any other living soul was not a thing that happened on this earth. And yet they all heard it. The four of them lifted their heads at once. The plodding, heavy footfall of a single exhausted animal just outside the porch. Then a heavy weight falling against the door. Then a man's voice half lost in the wind, calling out 2 words. "Hawthorne, open!" Caleb was on his feet. The sharps was in his hands. He was already across the room. "Who calls?" "Beckett, United States Marshal. Helena, open the door, Caleb. I have ridden 50 miles in this. I cannot stand much longer." Caleb threw the bar. He pulled the door inward with his shoulder. The wind came in. So did Marshal Thomas Beckett, falling forward, ice in his beard, his coat solid as a board, his face the gray of old paper. Caleb caught him under one arm. Jesse caught him under the other. They half carried him to the hearth and set him in the chair Caleb had just risen from. Eleanor was already at the fire pulling down the kettle. The marshal's gloved hands were frozen to the reins he had been holding. They had to cut the leather to get his hands free. Beckett looked up at the four of them through the firelight. His mouth tried to make words. His mouth was too cold to make words. He found them at last. "Pembroke," he said. "He is in Missoula. He came in 3 days ago. He has put up $500 on the head of a young woman from Boston. He has hired a man named Silas Crane. Crane left town yesterday morning at first light. He is on this mountain by now. He will reach this cabin by dawn." The cabin was very quiet for a moment. Eleanor set down the kettle. She walked slowly to the table. She placed both her small hands flat on the wood. She drew in one long, even breath. How many men is Crane bringing? Beckett looked up at her. The graying lawman, whose own father had been a friend of William Hawthorne 40 years past, looked at this small, straight Boston woman in his old friend's son's dead wife's mossy coat, and a small, startled respect moved across his frozen face. Two, ma'am. He travels with two. A man called Decker, a man called Mott. Both have records. Both are killers. 3 men total. 3 men total. Eleanor looked up. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Wyatt with his arm in the sling. She looked at Jesse with the white bandage at his neck. She looked at the gray, exhausted lawman in the rocking chair. Then we have until dawn, she said. Gentlemen, we have work to do. Caleb walked to the gun rack above the door. He took down the Sharps. He took down the Henry. He took down the second Sharps that had been his father's. He laid them one by one on the long plank table in a neat row beside the unlit candle stub and the empty tin can of California peaches, and the firelight caught on the long oiled barrels, and outside the wind tore at the roof, and somewhere on a buried trail in the dark below them, 3 men on 3 horses were riding up out of the storm to kill a young woman who had once eaten peaches and cream from a blue china bowl on a porch in Boston. The fight was coming. They worked through the night. Beckett once thought and Fed proved to be a sharper man than his exhausted entrance had suggested. He sat at the head of the table with a tin cup of coffee in his bandaged hands and laid out for Caleb what he knew of Silas Crane. Crane was 47 years old. Crane had served, if that was the word, in the late war on the side of certain Missouri raiders who had not been particular about uniforms. Crane had since hired his gun out in 3 territories. Crane preferred ambush to confrontation. Crane preferred dawn to dusk because the eye even of a wakeful man plays tricks at dawn. Crane did not enter a building from the front if a back was offered. Crane was, in the opinion of the United States Marshal Service, the most dangerous private gun west of the Mississippi for the simple reason that he did not enjoy the work, but was good at it, and a man who does not enjoy his work makes fewer mistakes than one who does. And his two, Caleb said. Decker is the muscle, big man, slow but steady, likes a knife. Mott is the climber, wiry, will go in a window before he goes in a door. He has done it in Cheyenne, he has done it in Salt Lake. Caleb nodded. He did not waste words. He laid out the cabin in his head the way a man lays out a chessboard. The front door with its heavy bar, the shuttered windows, 4 of them, 2 on each long wall, the single small window in the loft above the bedroom, which from outside looked like a vent, and from inside was a firing point a man could not reach without a ladder. The smokehouse, which was a possible flank, the barn, which was the obvious flank, the woodpile, which a careless attacker might use as cover, and which Caleb had never minded leaving, stacked just so for exactly that careless mistake. Wyatt, he said, how is the arm? It is the arm, brother. It is not the trigger finger. The right hand works. Sharps in the loft window. You have the angle on the front yard. You do not come down. You do not move. You shoot what comes. Yes. Jesse. Brother. Henry repeater. North window. You cover the smokehouse approach. You shoot anything that breaks the line of the woodpile. Yes. Marshal. Caleb. Sit. Do not move from that chair. Your hands have been frozen and they will swell. A swollen hand on a trigger is a danger to the man holding it and to no one else. You will keep that Colt of yours on your knee. If the door comes in, you will be the one they meet first. You will not miss. I will not miss, son, Caleb turned to Eleanor. She was standing at the foot of the rocking chair with her shoulders square and her hands folded in front of her like a girl at a recital. The firelight caught in her honey-colored hair and made it the color of old gold. Eleanor. Yes, Caleb. You will be in the bedroom, with the door barred from the inside. You will not come out for any voice but of mine. You will not come out for a voice that says it is mine if the voice is wrong and you know what wrong sounds like. The Colt, You keep the colt. There is a small high window above the bed. If a man comes around the back of the cabin to set a fire to the wall, you will see him from that window. If you see him, you will shoot him." She did not blink. "I will shoot him." "Good." He turned back to the table and to his brothers. "Last thing, Crane will come at first light. He will not come at midnight. He will not come at 3. He has 50 miles of dark trail behind him in this snow, and he will rest his men and his horses on the lee side of the ridge, and he will move when he can see the ground. We have until then to be ready and to sleep an hour each in turn. Wyatt sleeps first, Jesse sleeps second, I sleep last. The marshal sleeps when his hands stop hurting." "They are going to hurt for a while," Beckett said. "Then you do not sleep." "I will not." It was at that moment, while the brothers were arranging the rifles on the table and Beckett was wrapping a fresh strip of linen around his blackened fingers, that Caleb stood up and said quietly, "Eleanor, walk with me to the barn. I have a thing to give you." She looked up surprised. Then she nodded. She put on the mossy coat. She followed him out into the wind. The cold hit her like a closed hand, but the wind had begun very slightly to settle, and the snow had thinned, and the world between the cabin and the barn is a tunnel of swirling white, with the orange square of the cabin window at one end and the dark mouth of the barn at the other. He led her in. He hung the lantern on the iron hook by the gray mare's stall. The mare blew out a long, slow plume of breath and turned one curious dark eye on Eleanor. "This is Maple," Caleb said. "She is the steadiest horse I have ever owned. Hello, Maple." He walked to a corner of the loft where his pallet lay folded. From beneath the pallet, he drew out a small square package wrapped in clean linen. He turned with it in his big hand and stood for a moment holding it as if he were not sure now that he had it that he wanted to give it. "I made this," he said. "I have been making it since the night you came, a little at a time. I am not, you understand, a man who goes in for fancy work. I made one for Sarah once. After her, I made nothing. 3 nights ago in the loft after the wolves, I started this one. I finished it tonight while you were teaching Wyatt the letter G." He held it out. She took it. She unwrapped the linen. Inside lay a wooden spoon. It was carved from white birch. The bowl was deep and smooth, polished to the soft shine of a thing handled with care. The handle was the surprise. The handle had been carved with a long, slow climbing vine leaves and berries and tendrils running from the base of the bowl all the way to the small, flat end, and at the very end, almost too small to see 2 letters. E.W. She looked up. Her eyes filled. "Caleb, you should not eat your stew with that crooked tin spoon any longer. It is an insult to the stew. Use this one. It will wear in. The handle will fit your hand by spring. By next winter, you will not be able to use any other." She closed her hands around the spoon and held it against her chest. "Thank you. I have been wanting to give it to you for a week. I have not on account of a cowardice. But there are 3 men coming up the mountain to kill you in a few hours, Eleanor, and a man who stands on cowardice in such a circumstance is not, I think, a Hawthorne." She stepped forward. She tilted her face up to him. The lantern light caught in the amber of his eyes. He looked, she thought, very young in that moment, younger than he had ever let her see. "Caleb, Eleanor, I came here with a photograph and a letter from a man I did not know. I have stayed here a fortnight with a man who carves vines on a spoon for a woman he found in a snowdrift on Christmas Eve. The man with the photograph was a stranger. The man with the spoon is the one I am choosing. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because every other place is no place at all without you in it." He stood very still. Then he reached out slowly with one big calloused hand and tucked a stray strand of her honey-colored hair behind her ear and let his hand stay there for one heartbeat against her cheek and bent his head and kissed her. It was a small kiss. It was not a Boston kiss, and it was not a saloon kiss. It was a kiss of 2 cold mouths under a barn lantern with a horse breathing softly in her stall in a storm dying outside and three killers riding up out of the dark. It lasted no longer than a slow breath. When he straightened, he put both his hands on her shoulders and held her at arm's length and looked at her as a man looks at a thing he has just decided to spend his life keeping safe. Eleanor Whitmore, Caleb Hawthorne. After this morning, after these men, we will speak about a wedding. After this morning, yes. Now go inside, bar that bedroom door, and wait. She went. Crane came at first light and he did not come at the front. The wind had dropped to a long, steady sigh. The snow had stopped. The eastern sky was the gray of pewter going to the gray of slate. It was the hour when, as Beckett had said, the eye plays tricks. Caleb stood at the front shutter with one hand on the heavy timber bar and the other on his sharps and watched the open yard and saw nothing, saw nothing, saw nothing. And in the loft above the bedroom, Wyatt watched the same yard from the small high window and saw nothing also. It was Jesse at the north window who saw the first movement, a line of dark against the white of the smokehouse wall, low, crawling. "Mott," he said softly, "take him." The Henry cracked. Once. The dark line jerked. The dark line stopped moving. The next 2 seconds happened in 3 places at once. A shotgun roared from the timber line at the far edge of the yard. Decker. He was big and slow, but he had a good gun, and he had set up a position in the dark before dawn, and he was firing now to make Caleb show himself at the shutter. Buckshot tore the wood beside Caleb's head. He did not flinch. He shifted the sharps. He waited. And from the back of the cabin behind the bedroom came the soft scrape of a man climbing. Crane had not gone for the front. Crane had not gone for the side. So while Mott crawled and Decker drew fire around the back to the very wall Caleb had told Eleanor to watch. The wall with the small high window above the bed. The wall a man could approach in the dead ground where no rifle from the cabin could reach him. Eleanor saw him. She had been standing on the bed, the Colt in both hands, peering up through the small high window. She had been there 20 minutes. Her arms ached. Her eyes burned with looking. And then a shape came up out of the snow against the wall, a thin gray shape with a long pale face and a long octagonal barrel. And the shape lifted a small tin can from his coat pocket, and from the tin can, he poured something thick and dark down the joint of the timbers, and from his other pocket, he drew a tin box of lucifer matches. He was going to burn them out. She did not call. She did not warn him. She did not hesitate. She thumbed the hammer of the Colt. She set the muzzle through the small, high window so that the wood of the frame would steady her hands. She drew a breath. She let half of it out. She thought of her father in the carriage house of a Beacon Hill afternoon. She fired. The Colt jumped. The sound in the small bedroom was enormous. Silas Crane went down in the snow. The tin box of matches scattered. The dark coal oil on the wall did not catch because there was no spark to catch it, and because the man who had been about to set the spark was now lying with a hole in his chest and a look of mild surprise on his long pale face. And the only sound he made was the sound of a man who has been hit very hard from a direction he did not expect. In the front yard, Decker stood up out of the timber for 1/2 second to see what the new shot had been, and Caleb, who had been waiting for exactly that, took him through the throat with the sharps. Decker fell without another sound. The yard went quiet. Caleb threw the bar. He went out with the sharps. Wyatt came down from the loft. Jesse stayed at the north window with the Henry. Beckett stayed in the rocking chair with his swollen hands and his Colt on his knee, because a man who keeps his post even when the work seems done is the kind of man whose job is the marshal's badge. Crane was alive when they reached him. He was not going to be alive long. Caleb knelt in the snow beside him. He did not touch him. He only looked. Crane looked back. The pale eyes were already going far away. "She shot me," Crane said. "She did." "From the window?" "Yes." He was silent a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a small, dry laugh, not unkind, the laugh of a man who has been a professional all his life and who appreciates a good piece of work even when the work is on himself. Pembroke, Crane said, did not pay me 500, he paid me 2,000. He does not want her brought back. He wants her dead. She is the last living person who has the letter from his second wife, the wife he poisoned, the wife who wrote to her doctor before she went. Cordelia, did you know? I did not know, Caleb said. Now you know, the letter is in the Bible, in Esther. His pale eyes lost their focus. Tell her he said she shoots straight. He did not say anything else. Caleb stood up. He looked at his brother Wyatt. Wyatt looked back. Neither of them spoke. They carried Crane and Decker and Mott to the timberline and laid them out in a row in the snow, and they covered them with a tarp, and they weighted the corners of the tarp with stones because it was not a Hawthorne thing to leave even the dead to the wolves, and the marshal would want them when his hands healed enough to write up the papers. Beckett at the cabin door did not survive the morning. He had refused to sleep. He had not let on when Caleb had asked him about his hands how badly the cold had taken them. The frostbite had gone deeper than even Beckett had wanted to admit, and somewhere in the hour before dawn, sitting upright in the rocking chair with the Colt on his knee, Marshal Thomas Beckett had quietly stopped breathing. Eleanor found him when she came out of the bedroom. His eyes were open. There was no pain in his face. He had simply, in the manner of a man who had been a lawman for 30 years and who had ridden 50 miles in a killing storm to bring a warning to a friend's son, finished his job. They buried him at noon. They did not bury him in the timber with Crane and Decker and Mott. They dug a grave in the small clearing behind the cabin beside the 3 weathered stones under the pine. Caleb did the digging. Wyatt and Jesse stood on either side of him with their hats in their hands. Eleanor read from her mother's Bible. She read from the book of Esther, where she had carried all the way from Boston the proof of Cordelia Pembroke's murder, and where Marshal Beckett's last service had been, to confirm that the proof was real. She read the verses about a woman who was not afraid. Her voice did not shake. When the last shovel of earth had gone on, Caleb drew 4 smooth river stones from the pocket of his coat. He laid the first on the marshal's grave. He laid the second on William's grave. He laid the third on Anna's. He kept the 4th closed in his hand and stood beside Sarah's stone and stood there a long time. Eleanor came up to stand beside him. She did not speak. He spoke at last very softly, more to the pine than to her. Sarah, this is Eleanor. You knew her father. He wrote to me when you were sick. He could not save you. Nobody could. I am going to marry her in the spring. I want you to know that I have not forgotten you. I will not. But I have learned from the storm she walked through to get here that a heart can be a thing that does not have to choose. There is room. There has always been room. Forgive me for the years I thought there was not. He laid the last stone he was holding on Sarah's grave. He took Eleanor's hand. They walked back to the cabin. 3 days later, when the sky had cleared and the trail was passable, Wyatt rode for Missoula again. He carried the bodies on a sled and Beckett in a separate pine box that Caleb had built through the night, and a sealed packet of papers that included the full account of what had happened in the cabin and the letter from the Bible and Esther. He carried also, although he did not speak of it, a second smaller letter addressed to a Mrs. Margaret Sullivan of Denver, Colorado, sealed with wax and tucked into the inside pocket of his coat. Eleanor had asked him only one question about it before he rode out. She had asked whether he had written it himself. He had said yes. She had said good. She had said no more. He returned in 2 weeks with a U.S. Marshal from Helena and a federal warrant for the arrest of Augustus Pembroke and a stack of bank drafts from the territorial court that, when Pembroke's affairs were eventually settled in the spring, would restore to Eleanor Whitmore enough of her father's estate to buy a small set of medical books and an upright piano and a barrel of good Boston tea, all of which would be shipped west by rail in May. The wedding was on the 2nd of April, 1877. It was held in the cabin. Marshal Pierce, the new lawman out of Missoula, served as justice of the peace. Caleb gave Eleanor the small gold wedding band that had belonged to his mother Anna. Wyatt did not weep, but his eyes were red, and he stood up straight beside his brother and his brother's bride with the look of a man who has finally seen a thing he had stopped believing he would see. Jesse read aloud a few lines from Whitman, and his voice was gentle and clear, and when he was done, the cabin was very quiet for a moment. And then Caleb leaned down and kissed his wife in front of his brothers, in the marshal, in the pine rafters, in the fire on the hearth, and the door of his old life closed behind him with the same solid sound the timber bar made, only this time, for the first time in 9 years, the closing was not a locking out. It was a turning toward. That evening, when the marshal had gone and the brothers had retired to the loft of the barn for the night, so that the bride and groom might have the cabin to themselves, Caleb closed the heavy door and dropped the bar, and the wind on the porch was a low, quiet wind, and the firelight glowed orange in the warm timber room, and outside the first soft snow of April began to fall against the shutters. Spring came as it always comes to the high country. By the end of May, the creek was running brown and full, and the south slopes had gone the color of pale green velvet under the last melt. Eleanor planted a garden with seeds that had been her mother's, kept in a tin in the bottom of the leather trunk she had carried up the mountain. Caleb built her a small fenced plot behind the smokehouse and turned the earth himself with a spade. Wyatt, returning from a Missoula ride in mid-June, brought with him a young copper-haired widow with a small daughter named Lily, and the woman's name was Margaret Sullivan, and she had buried her flour merchant in Denver in the autumn of '74 of a lung sickness that had taken him quick, and she had received Wyatt's letter and read it 3 times in one night and had purchased a westbound ticket the next morning, and they were married in the cabin in October of that same year, and Lily, who was 4, took an immediate liking to Eleanor and called her Aunt Ellie before any of them had thought to teach her the words. In August of '78, Eleanor delivered her first child. Jesse, who had spent the year reading every medical text Eleanor had brought from Boston, and who had begun by quiet correspondence to consult with 3 Eastern physicians about practice in mountain country, served as midwife with Eleanor's coaching from her own bed. The boy was named Wendell Caleb Hawthorne, and Caleb, when he held him for the first time, sat down in the rocking chair without thinking about it at all, which Eleanor noticed and did not remark upon except to lay her hand on her husband's shoulder and squeeze it once and leave it there. In the winter of '81, in the worst cold the Bitterroot had seen since '76, a German neighbor named Otto Brennecke and his wife froze to death in their small cabin 8 miles south of the Hawthorne place. Caleb and Wyatt found them in February. Caleb buried them. Eleanor took in their 4-year-old son, Klaus, and the boy was raised at the long plank table in the cabin, with the Hawthorne dogs at his feet and a wooden spoon his stepfather had carved for him in the McGuffey primers Wyatt had once been embarrassed to read. In the spring of '84, Eleanor opened a small school in the front room of the cabin for the 11 children who lived within riding distance, and Jesse that same year opened a small medical practice in a 1-room office in the new settlement of Hawthorne Falls, which had begun to grow at the foot of the mountain where the trail came up out of the lower valley. He met a quiet school teacher from St. Louis named Constance Whitfield in the autumn of '89, and he married her under the lonely pine in the spring of '90, and they had 2 children of their own. And Constance taught at the schoolhouse in town while Eleanor taught the youngest at the cabin. In the summer of '94, a fire jumped the timber line above Hawthorne Falls and threatened to take the whole settlement. The Hawthorne brothers led the line of men who fought it, and the Hawthorne cabin became the rallying point for the women and the children of the town, and Eleanor, who had once been a stranger in a Boston traveling dress, was the center of the rallying. And when the fire was out and the town stood, the families of Hawthorne Falls came up the mountain together for a barn raising on the Hawthorne Ranch that lasted 3 days, and a fiddler named McGee played until midnight. On the second night, and Caleb Hawthorne, 51 years old that summer, danced one slow turn with his wife under the lanterns, and a long, quiet acceptance settled on the family that nothing afterward ever shook. In 1887, a daughter was born, Adelaide Hawthorne, Della to her brothers and her uncles and her cousins. She had her mother's honey hair and her father's amber eyes, and when Caleb held her for the first time, he wept openly. Not a thing his brothers had ever expected to see, and Eleanor said only, "It is all right, Caleb. She will know your face." The years went on, the way years go. Wendell, the eldest, went east at 18 on a scholarship secured by an old letter of recommendation Caleb had found in his wooden box. The brass-hinged box that had once held the letters from a Boston physician. And he studied medicine in the city his mother had been born in, and he came back at 28 to take over Jesse's practice at Hawthorne Falls, because Jesse by then had grown content to be the physician of last resort and to spend most of his afternoons fishing the creek with Lily's children. Klaus, the German boy, never left the mountain. He grew tall and broad and quiet, and he loved cattle, and he ran the Hawthorne herd with a steady hand from the time he was 16, and he married in his late 20s a girl from a homestead north of the falls. Adelaide Della helped her mother teach the youngest pupils at the cabin schoolhouse from the time she was 12, and the men of the territory wrote her many bad poems and a few good ones, and she chose in her own time, and not by anybody's pushing, a young rancher named John Calloway. And Caleb, when she brought the young man home to meet her father, sat with him for a long, quiet hour on the porch and asked him about his people, and learned that his grandfather had been the last of the Calloway raiders to escape and had died in a railway accident in Wyoming in 1871, and had left a son who had become a Union Pacific brakeman and had left a grandson who knew nothing of any of it. Caleb listened. Caleb said only at the end, "John, you are a good young man. I am not a man who holds a grandson responsible for the bones of a grandfather. You will have my daughter's hand, if she will have yours, and you will be welcome at this table for the rest of my life and longer." Adelaide married him in the spring of 1901, just shy of her 14th birthday, the way frontier weddings sometimes went, in those years when a young man and a young woman both knew their own minds. And in the 5 years that followed, they raised 3 small children at a homestead Caleb gave them as a wedding gift, half a mile down the slope from the original cabin. In the summer of 1906, on a clear afternoon the color of honey, the whole family gathered at the old Hawthorne place to mark 30 years. The cabin had grown. The original 4 rooms had become 12. 2 new wings had been added in 84 and 93, and the hearth Caleb had built with his father's hands was still the heart of it all. The same stones, the same iron crane, the same warm orange glow at evening. Wyatt and Margaret came up from their place on the lower draw with their 3 sons and their grown stepdaughter Lily, who had brought her own 3 children. Jesse and Constance walked over from town. Wendell came in as Trap from Hawthorne Falls with his wife Eliza and their 2 boys. Klaus drove down from the high pasture with his wife Annie and a pair of twin girls. Adelaide and John rode in with their 3. The grandchildren, when they were all together at last, numbered 17. They ran in the long grass between the cabin and the lonely pine, and the dogs ran with them, and somewhere a fiddle began to play. And the long plank table was carried out under the cottonwoods and laid with everything 4 kitchens could put on it. Caleb sat on the front porch in the wood chair he had carved for his bride 30 years before. He was 63 years old. His hair had gone the color of winter snow. His beard was white and trimmed close. The vision in his right eye had begun in the last winter to soften at the edges, and he no longer split his own kindling because his sons would not allow it. And the wound on his right thigh, the wound from the gray wolf who had come down out of the high country on a Christmas morning, ached in a damp wind. The wound on his left shoulder, the wound from Decker's last shot that had grazed him as he stepped out of the cabin door, that dawn long ago ached when he lifted a saddle. He lifted fewer saddles now. Eleanor sat beside him. She was 53. There was silver in her honey-colored hair. Her hands, the hands that had once stitched a wolf bite by firelight, were still steady, but they were also smaller than she remembered, and the knuckles had begun in the last year to swell with the cold mornings. She wore the small gold wedding band Anna Hawthorne had worn before her, and on a chain around her neck, she wore the small carved birch wood spoon her husband had given her in a barn lantern at 4 in the morning of the day 3 killers came up the draw. The spoon was 30 years old. The handle had worn smooth in the shape of her thumb. The vines along the shaft had darkened and softened with the oils of her hand. The family ate, the fiddler played, the grandchildren chased one another through the long grass and fell down and got up and fell down again and laughed the way only grandchildren ever laugh. The way that makes a porch full of grandparents stop mid-sentence and listen. When the sun had begun to sink behind the western ridge and the air had turned the color of pale gold, Caleb reached over and took his wife's hand. The hand fit his the way it had always fit. The fingers laced through his fingers, and the thumb pressed his palm, and the small gold band was warm. Caleb. Eleanor. She was looking out at the lonely pine. Beneath it now stood 5 stones, William and Anna, Sarah Ann, Marshall Thomas Beckett, and one further stone set in the spring of '98, when Adelaide had been 11, marking the small grave of Wyatt and Margaret's youngest, a daughter named Anna Margaret, who had lived only 11 days. The family tended that small stone every Sunday. Lily, who was now the eldest of the cousins, kept a fresh bundle of dried sage on it through every winter. "Do you remember," Eleanor said softly, "the night I came up out of the storm? The night you stood in the doorway and told me I had come up the wrong mountain? I remember every word. I have thought about it every Christmas Eve for 30 years. I came 2,000 miles on the strength of a letter that was a lie. I climbed a draw I had no business climbing. I knocked on a door no one had opened to a stranger in 3 years, and the man at the door told me plain that I had come up the wrong mountain. He was wrong. He was wrong, Caleb." He turned his head to her. The amber eyes were the same amber eyes, only softer now. The color of whiskey held a firelight that had begun to bank. "You came up the right mountain, Eleanor. You came up before I knew I had been waiting. The letter lied, but it lied true. It brought you to the door. The door was the only thing the letter ever needed to get right." She laid her head against his shoulder. The shoulder still ached when he lifted a saddle, but it did not ache when she laid her head against it. In the long grass below them, a small boy of about 5, the youngest of Klaus and Annie's, came running up the porch steps with a wildflower in his fist, and he stopped when he reached the top step, and he held the flower up to his grandmother with the deep, solemn attention of a child performing the sacrament. Eleanor took the flower. She thanked him. She kissed the crown of his sun-warmed head. He ran back down the steps and across the long grass and into the cluster of cousins by the cottonwoods. Caleb watched him go. He drew a slow breath. He let it out. "Winter always ends," he said. "Winter always ends, Caleb." The fiddler down by the cottonwoods began to play a slow waltz that Anna Hawthorne had taught her sons 50 years before, a Scottish air about a long road and a candle in a window. In the country, a man comes home to at the end of his life, and the grandchildren stopped running and gathered around the fiddler in a wide, rough circle, and Wyatt held out his hand to Margaret, and she took it, and Jesse held out his to Constance, and she took his, and on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands, an old mountain man stood up from his wood chair and held out his big calloused hand, palm up on the air between him and his wife. She rose. She laid her small hand in his. He closed his fingers around it very gently, the way a man closes his hand around a thing he does not intend to crush. They walked slowly down the steps and into the long grass under the cottonwoods, where the 17 grandchildren and the children of 3 Hawthorne households, and the 2 brothers, and the 2 sisters-in-law, and the Boos, and the lonely pine, and the 5 stones beneath it, and the sky over the Bitterroot all watched them, and the old man and the old woman began very slowly to dance. She still remembered and would remember every Christmas Eve until the last stepping down off a wagon into nothing 2,000 miles from home, with $11 in the lining of her coat and a letter in her pocket that had lied to her. She remembered the cold that had no bottom to it. She remembered the white wall of the world. She remembered 3 identical men in a doorway, and a voice rough as broken stone telling her she had come up the wrong mountain. The letter had lied, but it had walked her lie by lie to the right door, and on a porch in the long gold light of an evening 30 years on, with the fiddler playing and the grandchildren circling and her husband's hand warm around her own, She understood at last what her father had tried to tell her in a Boston reading chair so many years ago. The world is full of ledgers, and the world is full of promises, and only the promises ever build a thing worth standing on. The door had been the promise. The man at the door had been the promise. Everything good in her life had walked one slow step at a time through that door. She closed her eyes against the sun. She rested her cheek against his shoulder. "You're home now, darling," he said into her silver hair, "right where you're supposed to be." The fiddler played on. The grandchildren laughed. The high country held them, and the long hawthorn winter 30 years gone was at last and forever ended.